Margaret slammed the coffee pot onto the counter so hard the handle cracked clean off in her hand. Nobody looked up. That was the thing about being invisible. You could break something right in front of 30 people, and not one of them would turn their head. The 31st woman had just walked out of Caleb Whitaker's private room, wearing the same smile Margaret had seen on 30 faces before hers. Slow, satisfied, the smile of someone who believed they had already won. And Margaret stood behind that counter with a broken coffee pot and a truth in her chest that was going to kill her if she kept it inside one more day. If this is your first time watching our channel, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop a comment right now and tell me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me until the very end, because what happens between Margaret Ellison and Caleb Whitaker is not the story you think it is. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Mr. Hatch read it twice at the front desk of the Willow Creek Hotel, folded it carefully, set it down, picked it up, and read it a third time. Then he walked to the kitchen doorway and said, "Margaret, something bad is coming." And Margaret looked up from the dough she was working and said, "How bad?" And he said, "The kind of bad that doesn't fix itself." By noon, the whole town knew. By sundown, it was worse. The county land office had sent formal notice to Caleb Whitaker that the water rights attached to the Whitaker property, the single water source feeding every farm and small ranch in the entire valley, were subject to a legal provision his father had agreed to 20 years ago without fully understanding what he was signing. The provision was short, it was clear, and it was merciless. If the property remained under the management of an unmarried man at the time of the county inspection in September, the water rights would be reclassified, reassigned, sold to the highest bidder. Margaret stood in her kitchen that evening and let that sink in slowly. The highest bidder would not be a farmer. The highest bidder would be a railroad company, a mining operation, or one of the eastern land speculators who had been circling this territory for a decade, waiting for exactly this kind of crack to appear in the foundation. Willow Creek would not slow down. It would stop. She went out to her garden and turned the soil for a long time after dark, her hands moving through familiar rhythm, her mind moving through what she already knew was going to happen next. Caleb Whitaker was going to handle this the wrong way. She knew it before he opened his mouth at the town meeting 3 days later. The meeting was held in the hotel dining room because it was the largest indoor space still standing with all 4 walls intact. Margaret served coffee and kept her eyes down and stayed close to the wall because that was where invisible women stood. Caleb was at the front of the room with his hat in his hands and his jaw set in the way that men set their jaws when they were scared and had decided that no one was going to see it. "I'm going to find a wife," he said. "I'm going to do it before September, and I'm going to do it right." The room was quiet. Then old Gerald Marsh from the feed store ruin said, "How exactly you planning on doing it right, Caleb?" And the room exhaled a little because someone had said the thing everyone was thinking. "I'm going to interview women," Caleb said. "Any woman who wants to be considered can come to the hotel and speak with me privately. I'm not looking for a performance. I'm looking for honest conversation. I want someone real." Margaret pressed her back against the wall and thought, "You have just announced a performance competition and called it a search for honesty." She did not say that. She poured more coffee. She went back to her kitchen. The interview started Monday. The first woman was Clara Boone, 24 years old, daughter of the Boone family who farmed 2 miles outside town. She came in with her hair curled and her collar pressed, and she sat across from Caleb and said, "Mr. Whitaker, I have always loved ranch life. Hard work is something I genuinely look forward to every single morning." Margaret brought the coffee in and set it down, and Clara Boone did not look at her. "What kind of hard work?" Caleb asked. "All kinds," Clara said without blinking. "Whatever the land needs." Margaret had seen Clara Boone at the general store twice a month for 3 years. 6 months ago, Clara had spent 15 minutes complaining to anyone who would listen because she had to carry a flour sack to her wagon unassisted. Margaret set the cups down without a sound and left. In the hallway, she stopped and stood very still for a moment. Then she went back to her kitchen and said nothing to nobody. The second woman came from Hartwell, 50 miles east, and she told Caleb she had managed her late husband's property with full capability and had extensive experience with ranch operations. Her hands were soft, not the softness of a woman who took care of herself, the softness of hands that had never gripped anything harder than a pen for longer than 10 minutes at a stretch. That was not a flaw in her character, but it was a lie, and it was a lie told to a man making a decision that would determine whether 300 people had water to drink come winter. Margaret cleared the cups after she left. Caleb sat at the empty table for a moment before he called the next name. That was the thing Margaret started noticing. Those small pauses between interviews. The way he would sit alone for 2 or 3 minutes, not reviewing his notes, just sitting. Resetting something inside himself that kept getting knocked slightly out of place. She noticed it, the way she noticed everything quietly, without announcing it, filing it away in the back of her mind, where she kept all the things that were true, but not useful to say aloud. "Next one, ma'am," Caleb said when she came in with fresh coffee. "Yes, Mr. Whitaker." She left. She came back. She left again. This was the full extent of their relationship in 4 years. The fifth woman cried before she even sat down. She stood in the doorway of the private room, and her chin wobbled, and she said, "Mr. Whitaker, I know I'm not what you were expecting, and I know my family doesn't have land or money, but I am a hard worker, and I have never lied to a soul in my life, and I just want you to know that I would try so hard. I would try every single day." The room went completely silent. Caleb stood up from behind the table. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was gentler than Margaret had ever heard it. "Please sit down. Nobody's been turned away at that door yet." The woman sat. She wiped her eyes. She composed herself. And then she spent 40 minutes telling Caleb about all the ways her previous employer had praised her cooking, her diligence, and her character, none of which she had mentioned before she cried, and all of which arrived immediately after Caleb showed her kindness. Margaret stood in the hallway with the empty tray and understood what had just happened. She had weaponized her sincerity, not deliberately. Margaret did not think this woman was calculating in any conscious way. But desperation had its own intelligence, and without meaning to, this woman had discovered in real time that Caleb's gentleness could be leveraged, and she had leveraged it immediately. Margaret went back to her kitchen. She made more biscuits. She thought about what it meant that a good man's kindness could be used against him without anyone intending it. She thought about that for a long time. By the end of the second week, 16 women had sat across from Caleb Whitaker. Margaret had served coffee to all 16. Not one of them had looked at her directly. Not one of them had said thank you. She did not take this personally. She understood that she was furniture to them the same way she was furniture to most of the town, and she had made her peace with that understanding many years ago in the way that you made peace with things that weren't going to change, not by pretending they didn't hurt, but by deciding the hurt wasn't going to run your life. What she could not make peace with was watching Caleb come out of those interviews and sit with that expression on his face. She could not name it precisely. It was not disappointment exactly. It was more specific than that. It was the expression of a man who had gone looking for something he genuinely needed and kept finding reasonable substitutes that did not fill the particular shape of the need. Like drinking water when you were hungry. It addressed the surface. It left the real thing untouched. On the afternoon of the 15th day, she was carrying the lunch plates out, and she turned the corner into the hallway and nearly walked directly into Caleb coming the other way. They both stopped. He stepped back. She steadied the plates. "Sorry, ma'am," he said automatically. "No harm done, Mr. Whitaker." He looked at her for a half-second longer than he normally would have. "You doing all right today?" The question was so unexpected that Margaret answered it honestly before she had time to consider whether honesty was wise. "I'm doing fine. Are you?" He looked at her again. "I've been better," he said. Then he stepped around her and continued down the hallway, and Margaret stood there for a moment, holding the plates, and feeling something shift very slightly in the air between what was normal and what might become something else. She went back to her kitchen. She did not let herself think about it. The 20-second interview changed something. The woman's name was Ruth Delaney, And she was different from the others in a way that Margaret could not identify for the first 10 minutes, and then identified all at once with a cold certainty that landed in her stomach like a stone dropped in still water. Ruth Delaney was not performing. She was simply sitting across from Caleb and speaking in the flat, direct way of someone who did not have the energy or the inclination to construct an appealing version of herself. "I'll be honest with you, Mr. Whitaker," Ruth said. "I don't love the idea of marrying a stranger. I don't think I'll love ranch work. I've never loved hard physical labor, and I'm not going to pretend I will. But I'm a fair person, and I work at things I commit to, and if I give you my word, I'll keep it." Caleb leaned forward slightly. Margaret near the door went very still. "What would you need," Caleb said slowly, "to be willing to make that commitment?" "Honesty back," Ruth said immediately. "I need to know what I'm actually walking into. Not the version designed to make me say yes, the real version." The silence that followed was the longest, most alive silence Margaret had witnessed in that room. Then Caleb said, "The real version is harder than what I've been telling people." "I suspected that," Ruth said. "The ranch is in good shape financially," he said, "but it runs on work that doesn't stop. It runs on weather that doesn't cooperate, and livestock that dies when you've done everything right, and decisions that have to be made at 2 in the morning when you're too tired to think straight. The isolation is real. The loneliness is real. I have not been honest about the loneliness, because I didn't think it was something I was supposed to say in these conversations." Ruth looked at him steadily. "Why are you saying it now?" she asked. "Because you asked me to," he said. Something moved across Ruth Delaney's face that Margaret could not fully read from the doorway. Not warmth exactly. Recognition, maybe. The recognition of one honest person encountering another honest person in a situation that had not called for honesty. "I appreciate that," Ruth said. "Does it change your answer?" Caleb asked. Ruth was quiet for a long moment. "I need to think," she said. She left. She did not come back. Margaret found out 3 days later through the ordinary intelligence network of a small town. Someone told someone who mentioned it while picking up supplies that Ruth Delaney had accepted a position as a school teacher in a larger town 40 miles north and had left Willow Creek the same night as her interview. Margaret thought about that for a long time. She thought about what it meant that the most honest conversation Caleb had managed to have in 22 interviews had sent the woman walking out the door. She thought about what it said about the situation he was in, about the impossible position of a man who needed honesty, but had structured his search in a way that made honesty the most dangerous thing a woman could offer him. "Offer me the truth," he was essentially saying, "and I will use it to decide whether you are acceptable." And women understood at a level below conscious thought that unacceptable truths would cost them the only real opportunity in front of them. So they gave him acceptable truths. Or they gave him no truths at all, dressed in the clothes of truths. And Caleb sat in that room and kept coming out with that expression on his face, and the stone in Margaret's chest got heavier every single day. Then Vivian Caldwell arrived. She came on a Thursday in a hired buggy from Mill Haven, and she walked into the hotel with the posture of a woman who had been raised with money and the composure of a woman who had watched that money disappear and rebuilt something quieter and harder in its place. She was 33. She was not performing softness. She was not performing capability. She sat down across from Caleb and folded her hands on the table and said, "Mr. Whitaker, I'm going to skip the part where I tell you what I think you want to hear, because I suspect you're tired of it. My name is Vivian Caldwell. My father lost our family's property 3 years ago through a combination of bad investments and worse judgment. I have been working as an accounts manager for a dry goods operation in Mill Haven, and I am competent at it. I can read a contract, manage a ledger, and negotiate with suppliers. I understand what water rights mean legally, and I understand why September matters. I need security. You need a wife. I'm proposing that we discuss whether those two needs can become something workable." Caleb stared at her. "That's the most direct thing anyone's said in this room in a month," he said. "I find directness is more efficient," Vivian said. "What about the land itself?" Caleb asked. "Not the legal situation, the actual ranch, the work." "I'm not afraid of work," she said. "You said you'd skip telling me what I want to hear." A beat of silence. Fair point, she said. And for the first time, something shifted in her composure. Just slightly. A fractional adjustment. I don't know if I'll love ranch work. I don't have enough information to know. But I don't love the alternative either, and I'm at an age where I've stopped waiting for options that don't come with trade-offs. Caleb looked at her for a long time. That's honest, he said. Yes, she said. It is. Margaret, standing near the sideboard, studied Vivian Caldwell with the attention she applied to everything that mattered. And she felt it again, that cold, specific dread. Because Vivian was not lying. That was precisely the problem. Every previous woman had lied with varying degrees of enthusiasm, and Caleb had sensed the falseness even when he couldn't locate it exactly. But Vivian's words were accurate. Every single one. She did need security. She was capable and direct, and not pretending to feel things she didn't. She was simply choosing with great precision which truths to offer. The truths she was not offering lived in the small pauses before she answered questions about permanence. In the way her eyes moved very briefly toward the window whenever Caleb described the ranch's isolation. In the fractional tension around her jaw when he used the word forever. Those withheld truths told a story that the offered truths did not. Margaret picked up the empty cups. Neither of them looked at her. She left the room. She went back to her kitchen and stood at the window with her hands flat on the work table, and she looked at her garden, and she thought about partial truths and the specific kind of damage they did to people who were desperate enough to accept any truth at all as a gift. Outside, her tomatoes were coming in strong. The bean vines were climbing their poles with the blind, certain insistence that growing things had reaching toward light, regardless of what surrounded them, asking no one's permission, requiring no one's acknowledgement to do the work of becoming what they were. She had built that garden in her second year at the hotel, when Mr. Hatch said there was no budget for fresh vegetables, and she had looked at the empty dirt behind the back fence and seen something he could not see. She had built it herself. She had fed families with it during the hard winter 3 years ago when the supply wagons stopped coming. She had never once been thanked for it. She had never once expected to be. She knew her own worth. She had always known it. She just was not always sure that knowing was enough. 2 days after Vivian's interview, Margaret was carrying the breakfast plates down the hallway when she passed the open doorway of Caleb's private room and stopped without meaning to. He was alone. There was a blank piece of paper in front of him and a pen in his hand, and he had not written a single word. He was simply sitting with the full weight of everything pressing down on him in the way weight pressed on a person who had been carrying it alone long enough that they had forgotten what it felt like to put it down. He looked up and saw her. She should have moved. Margaret. It was the first time in 4 years he had used her name. She stopped completely. You've been in every one of these conversations, he said, bringing the coffee, clearing the plates. He set the pen down slowly. You hear things. She waited. I want to ask you something, he said. And I want a real answer, not the answer you think I want. Depends on the question, she said. Something shifted in his face. Quick, like recognition. Vivian Caldwell, he said. Tell me what you think. The room held still. Margaret set the plates on the sideboard and bought herself the seconds she needed to decide what kind of woman she was going to be in the next 2 minutes. She's telling you the truth, Margaret said. Caleb nodded. That's what I thought. She's telling you the truth, Margaret said again, with different weight on every single word about the things she's decided you need to hear. He went very still. There's a difference, Margaret continued, and her voice was steady, because she had spent a lifetime making her voice steady, when her hands were not between a woman who has nothing to hide and a woman who is very skilled at hiding. Miss Caldwell is not dishonest, Mr. Whitaker, but she is selective, and in your situation, selective is more dangerous than dishonest, because you can hear a lie. You can't always hear what isn't being said. Caleb stared at her. The silence stretched. What would you have me do? He finally said. And there was something rough underneath his voice now, something the composure could not fully cover. The inspector comes in September. I have run out of time, and I have run out of patience, and I am sitting here staring at a blank page because I don't know what I am even looking for anymore. I know, Margaret said. Then what? He said. What exactly am I supposed to do, Margaret? She looked at him directly. Not the careful peripheral attention she normally allowed herself. Directly. The way she would look at anyone she respected enough to be honest with. You built this whole process like a man buying livestock, she said. You created questions with right answers, and then you were surprised when women gave you the right answers. You wanted honesty, but you designed a room where honesty was the most dangerous thing a woman could walk in with. She stopped, breathed. Stop asking them what they want. Start watching what they do when they think you're not paying attention. A person's character isn't in the answer they prepared. It's in the 10 seconds before the answer when they're deciding how much truth they can afford. The room was completely silent. Caleb looked at her for a long time. You've been watching me fail at this for a month, he said. Yes. Why didn't you say anything sooner? Margaret picked up the plates she had set down. Because you didn't ask me, she said. And because it is not my place. I'm asking you now. I know, she said. And now I've told you. She walked to the door. Margaret. She stopped but did not turn around. If you were sitting across that table from me, he said quietly, the way a person said something they had not planned to say, what would you tell me? The thing nobody else has told me. The question landed in the center of her chest, like a hand pressed flat against a door she had been holding shut for a very long time. She turned around slowly. I'd tell you, she said, that you are not looking for a wife. You are looking for someone to fix your problem. And those are two different things. And until you understand the difference, it doesn't matter how many women walk through that door, because you are going to keep sitting in that room afterward, with that look on your face. What look? He said. The look of a man, she said, who is more alone after the conversation than he was before it. She left. She did not stop walking until she reached her kitchen. Her hands were shaking so badly, she gripped the edge of the work table and stood there breathing until they steadied. She had just told the wealthiest man in 3 counties that he did not know what he was doing. She had told him the woman he was closest to choosing was hiding something. She had told him truths that no one else in Willow Creek had the position or the nerve to say. She had risked her job. She had risked her home. She had risked the only stability she had ever built from nothing with her own 2 rough, warm, capable hands. She looked out the window at her garden. The tomatoes. The beans climbing their poles. Growing toward light because that was what growing things did not. Because anyone was watching. Not because anyone had given them permission, but because it was simply their nature, and they could not be otherwise. Margaret Ellison straightened her back. She let go of the work table. She picked up her apron and tied it and went back to work. Outside, the summer sun pressed down on Willow Creek like a judgment. The empty storefronts stood their silent watch. The streets that had once carried the noise of commerce and arrival and possibility were quiet in the way that places went quiet when the future stopped coming through them. But in the kitchen of the Willow Creek Hotel, something that had been held down for a very long time was beginning slowly and without announcement to rise. Caleb did not sleep that night. Margaret knew this because she was awake herself at 3 in the morning, the way she was always awake at 3 in the morning when something important was sitting unresolved in the air, and she heard his boots on the floorboards above her room, slow, deliberate back and forth, the specific rhythm of a man who had too much to think about and nowhere to put it. She lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to him pace. She did not feel satisfied about what she had said to him. She felt afraid, not the kind of afraid that made you wish you had stayed silent. She had passed that point long ago, somewhere in the middle of her 2nd year in Willow Creek, when she had decided once and for all that silence had a cost, same as honesty did, just a slower and quieter one. The kind of afraid she felt now was the kind that came after you had done the right thing and were waiting to find out what it was going to cost you. The boots stopped pacing around 4. She eventually slept. She was back in the kitchen before 6. Caleb came down for his coffee at 7, same as always, and when she set the cup in front of him, he looked at it for a moment, and then looked at her and said, "I owe you an apology." Margaret kept her hands busy with the biscuit pan. "No, you don't." "I've been coming to this hotel for 4 years," he said. "I didn't know your last name until yesterday." "Ellison," she said. "Though you didn't ask." "I know I didn't." He wrapped both hands around the cup. "That's what I'm apologizing for." She looked at him then. Really looked the way she had allowed herself to look only twice before, once, when he'd been hurt after a thrown horse and sat bleeding quietly in the dining room, waiting for the doctor, and once last night when he'd asked her the question she hadn't been prepared for. He looked like a man who had spent the night dismantling something he'd built carefully, and was not yet sure what to construct in its place. "Apology accepted," she said. "Your eggs will be ready in 10 minutes. He nodded. He didn't leave this counter. "What you said last night," he started. "Mr. Whitaker." "Let me finish." He set the cup down. "You said I was looking for someone to fix my problem. That I wasn't looking for a wife, I was looking for a solution." He paused. "I've been sitting with that since last night, and I can't find a way to argue with it. I don't like it. But I can't argue with it." Margaret turned to face him squarely. "Most people can't do both at the same time." "Can't do what?" "Dislike a truth and still accept it," she said. "Most people pick one." Something moved across his face that she didn't have a name for yet. "Which one do you usually pick?" he asked. She almost smiled. "I accepted a long time ago that I don't get to dislike things that are true. Takes too much energy I don't have to spare." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked his coffee up and went to his table, and she went back to her biscuits, and neither of them said anything else, and it was somehow the most honest conversation she had been part of in years. Vivian Caldwell came back that morning. She arrived at 9:30, no appointment, and she walked into the hotel with a different quality in her step than she'd had 2 days before. Something pressed down, something controlled, very deliberately. She asked the front desk for Mr. Whitaker and was shown to the private dining room, and Margaret, carrying the hot water for the tea service, was 3 steps behind her, and heard everything from the moment the door was not quite fully closed. "I want to revisit something from our last conversation," Vivian said. "All right," Caleb said. "You asked me what I wasn't telling you." A pause. "I remember," he said. "I didn't answer you honestly." Her voice was steady, but Margaret, standing on the other side of that door, could hear what steadiness was doing the work of covering. "I told you that everyone has things they don't volunteer. That was true, but it was also a deflection, and I think you knew it." "I suspected it," Caleb said carefully. "I have a debt," Vivian said. "A significant one. My father's debt technically, but it was transferred when the property was sold, and the sale didn't cover the full amount. I have been managing it in Millhaven, but it is not—" Another pause, briefer, tighter. "It is not something I would be bringing into a marriage as a clean slate." The silence that followed was long enough that Margaret counted 12 seconds of it. "How much?" Caleb asked. Vivian told him. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. It was not a catastrophic number, not for a man in Caleb's position. But it was not small, and more importantly, it was the kind of information that changed the entire shape of a conversation. It meant that Vivian's eagerness for this arrangement was not simply practical preference, it was financial pressure. Real active pressure with a timeline. "Why are you telling me this now?" Caleb asked. "Because someone reminded me recently," Vivian said, and her voice was so carefully neutral it was almost its own kind of answer, of the difference between a partial truth and a real one. Margaret moved away from the door. She walked back to the kitchen and set the hot water down and stood at her work table and understood that something she had set in motion the previous evening had just arrived at a consequence she had not fully anticipated. Vivian had heard something, or sensed something, or been told something, and it had shaken loose the information she had been managing so carefully. That was good. That was also terrifying, because a woman who had just confessed a significant debt to the man she needed to marry was a woman who was now vulnerable in a way she had not been before, and vulnerable women in difficult positions did not always respond with gratitude towards the person they believed had created that vulnerability. Margaret began peeling potatoes. She peeled them very fast. 20 minutes later. Vivian Caldwell walked through the kitchen, not the front door. The kitchen door, which meant she had found the back hallway deliberately, and stopped when she saw Margaret at the work table. The two women looked at each other. "You spoke to him last night," Vivian said. It was not a question. "I answered a question he asked me," Margaret said. She did not stop peeling. "About me. About the interviews in general." She set one potato down and picked up another. "He asked my opinion. I gave it." Vivian was quiet for a moment. She was a composed woman. Margaret had registered that from the beginning, but the composure was doing more visible work right now than it had been 2 days ago. "What exactly did you say?" Vivian asked. "I said you were selective," Margaret told her. "I said there was a difference between having nothing to hide and being skilled at hiding. I didn't tell him what you were hiding because I didn't know the specifics. I only knew the shape of it." "The shape of it," Vivian repeated slowly. "You wanted this arrangement more than you wanted him to know how much you wanted it," Margaret said. "That kind of gap between what a person shows and what a person feels, it has a particular shape. I've been watching it my whole life, because it's the shape most people show me." She paused. "I didn't mean you harm Miss Caldwell. I meant him honesty. Those aren't always the same direction." Vivian Caldwell stood very still. Then she said quietly, and without venom, but with a precision that made it land exactly as hard as she intended. "You are aware, aren't you, that you have made this considerably more difficult for yourself?" "How so?" Margaret said. "Because now he's going to look at you differently." She tilted her head fractionally. "And a man looking at the kitchen woman differently is not a comfortable position for the kitchen woman to be in. Not in this town. Not with the people who run it." Margaret looked up from the potato in her hand and met Vivian's eyes directly. "Miss Caldwell," she said, "I have been invisible in this town for 10 years. The people who run it have never once looked at me long enough to form an opinion worth worrying about. If you're suggesting that I should have stayed quiet to protect my own comfort..." She set the potato down. "I didn't have a comfortable position to begin with. You can't threaten someone with the loss of something they never had." Vivian stared at her. Something shifted in her face. Not hostility, or not only hostility. Something more complicated than that. Something that looked around the edges, faintly like recognition. "You're braver than you look," Vivian said. "Most people are," Margaret said. "When looking doesn't cost them anything, they don't bother." Vivian left through the back door. Margaret stared at the pile of potatoes for a moment. Then she went back to peeling. By noon the hotel was buzzing with the specific low-frequency hum of a small town that had gotten hold of new information and was not yet sure what to do with it. Margaret could hear it in the dining room, the way conversations stopped when she came through with the food and started again as she left. She had spent enough years being invisible to know the difference between not being noticed and being noticed carefully. They were noticing her now. The first person to say something directly was Ada Marsh, Gerald's wife, who came in for lunch and waited until Margaret was refilling her water glass to say without looking up from her plate, "I hear you've been putting yourself into Mr. Whitaker's business." Margaret filled the glass without spilling a drop. "I'm not sure what you've heard, Mrs. Marsh. I heard you told him Vivian Caldwell wasn't suitable." Ada Marsh cut her food with the precise movements of a woman who considered every action a statement. "I heard you've been listening at doors." "I've been serving coffee," Margaret said, "in the room where the conversations were happening, at Mr. Whitaker's request." "There's serving coffee and there's inserting yourself," Ada said. "You know the difference." "I do," Margaret said. "Mr. Whitaker asked my opinion directly. I gave it. That's not insertion, Mrs. Marsh. That's answering a question." Ada Marsh finally looked up. She was 61 years old, and she had the eyes of a woman who had run this town's social order for 40 of those years, and knew exactly where every person stood in it, and exactly what happened to people who moved out of their designated position without permission. "You're a good worker, Margaret," she said. "You always have been. Don't make the mistake of thinking that changes what you are in this town." Margaret held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to be clear, not long enough to be a challenge. She couldn't back up. "Yes, ma'am," she said. She went back to the kitchen. Her jaw ached from how hard she had held it still. Caleb spent the afternoon at the hotel, which was unusual. Normally, after his morning coffee, he rode it back to the ranch and returned the following day. But he stayed, and Margaret was aware of his presence, the way she was aware of the weather, not looking at it directly, but always knowing where it was. At 3 o'clock he came to the kitchen doorway. Margaret was the only one there. The lunch service was done, and the supper prep had not yet started, and the kitchen had that rare afternoon quiet that she usually had entirely to herself. "Can I come in?" he asked. Nobody asked to come into her kitchen. "It's Mr. Hatch's kitchen," she said. "I don't have authority to give permission." "I'm asking you," Caleb said. She nodded. He came in and stood at the far end of the work table, with his hat in his hands. He always took his hat off. Indoors, she had noticed that in 4 years he always took it off without thinking. The automatic courtesy of a man raised carefully, and he said, "Vivian told me this morning about the debt." "I know," Margaret said. "I heard her come in." "She told me you spoke to her after." "She came to find me," Margaret said. "I didn't seek her out." "I know." He turned the hat in his hands once. "Margaret, what she owed the amount, it doesn't change things practically for me. The ranch can absorb it. That's not the issue." She waited. "The issue," he said, "is that she's been sitting across from me for 2 conversations, and that was the most important thing she needed to say, and she only said it because she thought you'd already told me." He stopped turning the hat. "If you hadn't said what you said last night, if you hadn't made her think I already knew the shape of it as you put it, she would have come to September without saying a word." "Probably," Margaret said, "and I would have married her thinking we were starting honest." "Yes." He was quiet for a long time. "I've been going about this all wrong," he said. "I told you that last night," she said. "You didn't disagree." "No." He almost smiled. "You didn't give me much room to." "Room to disagree with a true thing is just room to be comfortable," she said. "I didn't see the point." He looked at her then in the direct way he'd been doing more frequently in the last 24 hours, and Margaret made herself hold it, because looking away first was a habit she had developed out of survival, and she was trying to decide whether that survival still required it. "Why have you never spoken up before?" he asked. "Not just about this. In general. You clearly see things. You think clearly. You're not afraid to say a hard truth when it matters. Why is this the first time I've ever heard you say more than 3 words?" The question was so honest and so plainly asked that she answered it the same way. "Because no one asked," she said. "And because in this town, a woman who looks like me and works where I work doesn't say hard truths to wealthy men without consequences. Not usually." "And now," he said. "Now you asked," she said. "And the consequences were already here whether I spoke or not." He set his hat on the end of the work table. It was a small gesture, oddly significant. Setting his hat down meant he was staying, meant this was a conversation and not a check-in, meant he had made a decision about the amount of time and weight he was willing to give to this particular exchange. "Tell me something," he said. "Honest answer. What do you actually think I should do?" "About Miss Caldwell." "About all of it." Margaret thought about it. Not performing thought, actually thinking the way she thought about her garden, or her kitchen accounts, or the logistics of feeding 60 people on a budget that should have fed 30. "I think," she said, "that you need to stop treating this like a problem with a solution and start treating it like a life with a direction. Solutions have endpoints. Lives don't." She picked up a cloth and dried her hands. "You've been asking women if they fit a set of requirements, but you don't actually know what you require because you've never sat down and asked yourself that question. You know what the county requires. You know what the ranch requires. But what does Caleb Whitaker require? Not the rancher. The man." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from the others she had heard in this hotel. This one was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a person encountering a question they had not known they needed to hear, turning it over carefully, finding it heavier than it looked. "That's a harder question than anything I've asked any of them," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "That's why you haven't asked it." He picked his hat up slowly. "Thank you, Margaret," he said. It came out differently than the pro forma thank you she'd heard from him for 4 years. It had mass to it. Weight. "Mr. Whitaker," she said as he turned toward the door. He stopped. "For what it's worth," she said. And she had not planned to say this. It arrived without warning from somewhere she didn't fully govern. "You're not as alone in this as you think you are. There are people in this town who care what happens to you, not to your water rights, to you." He stood with his back to her for a moment. "Name one," he said quietly. She said nothing, but she didn't look away when he turned around and found her eyes. He left. She stood in the quiet kitchen and let the feeling of what had just happened settle through her like heat through a cold room, slow, thorough, changing the temperature of the air. Then Mr. Hatch appeared in the doorway and said the roast needed to go in, or supper would be late, and Margaret tied her apron tighter and went back to work. That evening, while the supper dishes were being cleared, a man named Douglas Hale arrived in Willow Creek. Margaret noticed him first because she noticed everything, and what she noticed about Douglas Hale was a specific quality of deliberateness, the way he moved through the hotel lobby, not like a traveler arriving, but like a surveyor taking measurements. He registered at the front desk, asked careful questions about the area, and mentioned 3 times in different configurations that he was in the territory on behalf of an investment group interested in regional development opportunities. He said the words, regional development opportunities, the way some men said, grace before a meal, automatically reverently, as if the phrase itself was sacred. He ordered supper in the dining room and ate slowly and listened to everything around him with the specific attentiveness of a man who was not actually there for the food. Margaret refilled his water glass twice, and the second time he looked up at her, really looked the way men like him looked at people in service positions when they needed something from them. "You work here regular?" he asked. "Yes, sir," she said. "Know most of the people in town?" "A fair number." "Know anything about the Whitaker Ranch water situation out there?" Margaret kept her face completely neutral. "I know Mr. Whitaker takes his coffee black," she said. "Beyond that I couldn't say." Hale smiled. "Course not." She went back to the kitchen and stood at the window and felt the stone in her chest get heavier and sharper and altogether more serious. She did not know exactly what Douglas Hale was, but she knew what he represented. Someone had sent him here. Someone who knew about the water rights, about the September deadline, about the specific legal vulnerability that Caleb was racing against. Someone who wanted that vulnerability to remain unresolved long enough to become an opportunity. The question was who? The question was how much time had already been lost. She was still thinking about it when the back door of the kitchen opened at 8 o'clock that evening, and Billy Marsh, Ada's grandson, 14 years old, the boy who ran messages for half the town, stuck his head in and said, "Miss Margaret, Mr. Whitaker wants to know if you'd be willing to come talk to him. He's in the parlor." Margaret dried her hands. She untied her apron. She walked into the parlor. Caleb was standing by the window with a piece of paper in his hand and an expression on his face that was categorically different from every expression she had seen on it before. Not the exhaustion of the interviews, not the cautious hope, not the grinding weight of the legal situation. This was something colder. "Do you know a man named Douglas Hale?" he asked. "I served him supper," she said. "He was asking about the ranch, about the water." "I know." Caleb held the paper out. "This was delivered to me an hour ago. It's an offer. From a land acquisition group out of Denver." He paused. "They want to purchase the water rights at fair market value before the inspection. They're presenting it as a solution, a way for me to settle the legal issue without having to marry anyone." Margaret took the paper and read it. She read it twice. "This isn't a solution," she said. "No," Caleb said. "It's a buyout. The moment I sell those rights, every farm in this valley is at the mercy of whatever price that group decides to charge for water access. And that price will be whatever the market allows, not whatever the people here can pay." "Who told them about the deadline?" she said. "That's what I'd like to know." "Someone who knew about the provision," she said slowly. "Someone who had access to the county records or knew your father's legal arrangements. Or someone who has been waiting for exactly this kind of situation," Caleb said, and finally found it. They stood in the quiet parlor, and the weight of what Douglas Hale's arrival actually meant settled between them like a third presence in the room. This was not simply a legal inconvenience anymore. Someone had engineered it. Someone was watching the clock on the September deadline and had sent a representative to Willow Creek at a specific moment, not too early, not too late. Calculated to arrive when Caleb was tired and pressured and running short on options. "What are you going to do?" Margaret asked. "I'm going to find a wife," he said. "Before September." "Before September," he confirmed. "And I'm going to do it right this time. Not the way I've been doing it." He looked at her steadily. "You told me yesterday that I don't know what I require, that I've never asked myself what Caleb Whitaker, the man, actually needs." "I remember," she said. "I've been thinking about that all day," he said. "And I think you're right. I think I've been so focused on the practical problem that I've been treating the human part of it like a variable I could just fill in later." He stopped. "I don't want to do that." "Then don't," she said. "I need your help." She looked at him. "Not to find a wife," he said quickly, and something in his face shifted in a way she couldn't fully interpret. "I need someone who will tell me the truth when I'm wrong. Someone who has been paying attention to this situation from the outside and can tell me when I'm lying to myself. I've had 30 conversations in that room, and not one of them gave me that." He paused. "You gave it to me in 3 minutes." Margaret was quiet. "I'll pay you for your time," he said. "Whatever you think is fair. I don't want to take advantage of your—" "Don't," she said. He stopped. "Don't offer me money for honesty," she said. "That's not what this is." The word "this" hung in the air between them for a moment, neither of them reaching for it or defining it. "Then what is it?" he said. She thought about it. "A conversation between two people," she said, "who are both trying to figure out what the truth actually is." She folded the paper and handed it back to him. "And you need to find out who sent Douglas Hale here before you do anything else. Because whoever is behind that offer knew about your deadline and your legal situation, and they've been waiting for it. That's not business opportunism. That's a plan." Caleb looked at the paper in his hand. "You think someone in this town. I think someone knows this town," Margaret said. "Whether they're in it or watching it from a distance, I don't know. But someone has been waiting for this crack to open wide enough to put something in it. And right now, Mr. Whitaker, you are the crack." He looked at her. Then very quietly, something shifted in the way he was standing. A fractional reorganization. The way a person stood when they had just made a decision. They had been approaching for a while and finally arrived at. "Caleb," he said. She blinked. "I beg your pardon." "My name," he said. "You've been calling me Mr. Whitaker for 4 years. I'd like it if you'd call me Caleb." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, outside the parlor window. Willow Creek was settling into its evening quiet. The street was empty. The last light was going red along the horizon. The town that had once been full of noise and life, and the kind of ordinary human chaos that meant people were investing in a future here, sat still in the cooling air, like a question waiting to be answered. She thought about what Ada Marsh had said to her over lunch. She thought about what Vivian Caldwell had said in the kitchen. She thought about every year of being invisible, and every morning of knowing her own worth anyway, and every choice she had ever made to tell the truth, because silence had a cost too. "All right," Margaret said. "Caleb." He nodded once. "Now," she said, pulling her shawl straight with the practicality she applied to everything. "Tell me everything you know about who else in this county had access to your father's original land agreement. Because whoever Douglas Hale works for didn't find that provision by accident. Someone showed it to them. And that someone is a great deal more dangerous than any of the 30 women who walked through that door." Caleb spread the papers across the parlor table, and Margaret leaned in beside him, and neither of them pretended this was anything other than what it was. Two people working a problem together, because the problem was too large and too dangerous for one person to hold alone. The original land agreement was 23 pages of dense legal language written by a county clerk in 1851, and Caleb's father had signed it without a lawyer present because lawyers cost money that the Whitaker Ranch did not have in 1851. Caleb had read it 3 times since the county letter arrived, and each time he had come away with the same sick certainty his father had not understood what he was signing, and whoever had drafted the provision had known exactly what they were drafting. "This language here," Margaret said, pointing to the third page without touching the paper. "This provision about marital status. It's written differently than the rest of the document." Caleb looked at where she was pointing. "Different how?" "The rest of it reads like standard county language," she said. "Repetitive formal, the same phrases used 4 different ways to say one thing. But this section is precise, specific. It doesn't repeat itself. Whoever wrote this part knew exactly what they wanted it to say and didn't need 3 attempts to say it." He looked at her. "You can tell that from reading it once," he said. "I've been managing Mr. Hatch's contracts and supply agreements for 6 years, she said. "A man who writes something sloppy is careless. A man who writes something precise in the middle of something sloppy is deliberate." Caleb sat back. "My father trusted the county clerk," he said. "Man named Harrow. Died 8 years ago." "Who replaced him?" "Fellow named Silas Greer. Been county clerk for the last 8 years. He paused. "Greer is the one who sent the notice about the inspection." "And who does Silas Greer talk to?" Margaret said. The question sat in the air between them. Caleb's jaw tightened by a fraction. "I need to make a trip to the county seat." "Not yet," Margaret said. "Not until you know who you're walking toward. If Greer is involved in this, if he's connected to whoever sent Hale, then showing up at his office asking questions tells them exactly how much you know and exactly how worried you are." She looked at him steadily. "Right now, your advantage is that they don't know what you know." "My advantage," he said slowly. "A week ago I would have said I didn't have any." "You have more than you think," she said. "You have time. Barely, but you have it. And you have the fact that Douglas Hale is still sitting in this hotel eating my cooking, which means they haven't given up on the quiet approach yet." Caleb looked at her with an expression she was starting to recognize. It was the look of a man who was accustomed to being the smartest person in most rooms and was encountering with something between discomfort and relief, a situation where that was not the case. "What do you suggest?" he said. "I suggest," she said, "that someone pays very close attention to what Douglas Hale does and who he speaks to while he's under this roof. And I suggest that person not be you, because he'll watch himself around you." "He won't watch himself around you," Caleb said. "People like Douglas Hale never watch themselves around people like me," she said. "That's the second time in my life that being invisible has been genuinely useful." He looked at her for a long moment. "The first time," he said. 30 interviews, she said. "I heard every word." He almost smiled. Then something shifted in his face, and the almost smile became something more serious, something that was paying attention in a different way. "Margaret, what did you actually hear in those interviews? Not the summaries. What do you actually know about each of those women?" And that was the moment the conversation changed direction entirely. She told him, not everything. Not the private griefs and fears she had read in the spaces between sentences. Those were not hers to give, but the factual observations, the contradictions between what women had claimed and what their bodies and habits and histories said. She told him about Clara Boone's hands and what they did and didn't know. She told him about the woman from Hartwell, whose financial records were almost certainly not as clean as she'd implied. She told him about the fifth woman who had weaponized her tears without meaning to, and about Ruth Delaney, who had been the most honest of all of them, and left because honesty cost too much in a room designed to punish it. Caleb listened without interrupting. He was a good listener when he chose to be. She had observed that over 4 years, without ever having occasion to be the recipient of it. It was one of the things she had noticed about him filed away, and never expected to use. When she finished, he said, "Why did you never tell me any of this?" "You never asked me," she said. "And you were looking for a wife, not an intelligence report." "Maybe I needed both." "Maybe," she said. "But a man who's been told what he needs and a man who's ready to hear it are 2 different men. You weren't ready until Tuesday night." He accepted that. Outside in the hotel, Douglas Hale finished his supper and ordered a whiskey at the small bar Mr. Hatch kept for guests, and Margaret, passing through on her way back from the linen closet, heard him strike up a conversation with 2 ranchers from outside town who had come in for the night. She slowed her pace without stopping and let her ears do what they had always been best at. Hale was asking about Caleb, not directly. He was asking about water prices, about the cost of drought years, about what happened to small farms when they lost reliable water access. The ranchers answered freely because the questions seemed general, and because Douglas Hale had a face that inspired easy confidence, open, interested, nothing sharp showing on the surface. But the questions were not general. They were a map being drawn. Margaret went to the kitchen and wrote 3 sentences on a scrap of paper and asked Billy Marsh to carry it up to the parlor. Caleb came down 7 minutes later. He went to the bar and ordered a whiskey of his own and sat 2 seats from Hale and struck up the kind of easy, directionless conversation that men struck up in bars in small frontier towns where there wasn't much else to do after dark. Margaret watched from the kitchen doorway. Caleb was good at this. She had not expected that. He had the manner of a man who was comfortable with silence and comfortable with other people's talking, and he let Hale fill the space between them with his own words. Within 15 minutes, Hale had told Caleb 3 things he almost certainly had not intended to share: that his employers had been tracking the Whitaker property for at least 2 years, that the offer he had delivered was not the only approach they had planned to take if the direct approach failed, and that he expected to be in Willow Creek for at least another 2 weeks. 2 weeks. The inspection was 8 weeks out. They had time built into their plan, which meant their plan had more steps than a simple buyout offer. Caleb excused himself at 9 o'clock with the easy manner of a man turning in early, and when he passed the kitchen doorway, his eyes found Margaret's for exactly 1 second. And in that second, she understood that he had heard the same things she had heard and drawn the same conclusions, and the understanding moved between them like a current through water, fast, invisible, completely real. She went to bed that night with her mind still working. She woke up at 5 with the answer to a question she hadn't consciously known she was asking. The provision in the land agreement was precise in the middle of something sloppy. That meant it was added, not original to the document, added later or written separately, and inserted by someone who knew exactly what it would do and when it would do it. Someone who had been patient enough to wait 20 years for the right circumstances to make it useful. Harrow, the original county clerk, had been dead for 8 years, but Harrow had a son. Margaret knew this because she knew everything about Willow Creek, the way a person knew a place they had watched carefully for 10 years without ever being invited to participate in it. Thomas Harrow, the clerk's son, had left Willow Creek 15 years ago and gone east to study law. She did not know where he had ended up. She was fairly certain that Douglas Hale's employers did. She had the coffee ready when Caleb came down at 7, and she told him what she had worked out before he had taken his second sip, and she watched his face go through 3 distinct expressions in the space of 10 seconds. Surprise, calculation, and then a cold, focused clarity that she had not seen on him before, and that told her something important about who Caleb Whitaker was underneath the composure and the courtesy. He was not simply a rancher managing a legal problem. He was a man who, when given accurate information and adequate provocation, became genuinely dangerous to underestimate. "Thomas Harrow," he said. "I could be wrong," she said. "You're not," he said. "I knew Thomas Harrow when we were boys. His father and mine were friendly until about—" He stopped. Something moved across his face. "Until about the time my father signed that agreement." The kitchen was very quiet. "Caleb," Margaret said carefully. "I know," he said. "You need to be sure before you act on this." "I know that too." He set the coffee down. "I need to get to the county seat and look at the original filing records. The ones that would show when that provision was drafted, not just what it says. And if Greer is involved—" "Then I don't go to Greer," he said. "There's a federal land office in Cheyenne. They maintain parallel records for exactly the kind of situation where county records might be." He paused on the word. "Compromised. How long to get to Cheyenne and back?" 4 days hard riding, 6 if I don't push." "You have 8 weeks, she said. "I'll push," he said. He left within the hour. He came to the kitchen doorway before he went and said, "Watch Hale. Don't let him know you're watching. If he does anything that feels wrong, get word to my ranch foreman. His name is Pete Aldridge. He'll know what to do." "And Miss Caldwell," Margaret said. Caleb was quiet for the moment. Be straight with her if she asks. She deserves that much." He left. Margaret stood in the kitchen and listened to his horse leave and felt the particular quality of absence that followed when someone whose presence you had started to rely on was no longer there. She did not like the feeling. She went back to work. Vivian Caldwell appeared at breakfast and ate alone at the corner table and did not look at the kitchen door, which told Margaret that she was thinking very hard about something and trying not to be visible while she did it. After the other guests had cleared out, Margaret brought fresh coffee to her table, and Vivian looked up and said, "He's gone." "Business," Margaret said. "He didn't tell me he was leaving." "No," Margaret said. "He left in a hurry." Vivian wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. She was a composed woman, but composition was a choice, and choices got harder to sustain when you were frightened, and Vivian Caldwell was frightened. Not of Caleb specifically. Of the shape of the situation, of how little control she had over something she had invested considerable courage in approaching honestly. "Miss Caldwell," Margaret said, and she sat down across from her because standing over someone who was frightened was a particular kind of cruelty she was not willing to commit, even when it would have been easier to keep her distance. "He'll be back. What he's doing is necessary, and it's connected to the water rights situation in a way that changes the whole picture." Vivian looked at her directly. "How connected?" "Someone is trying to take the water rights away from Caleb before September," Margaret said. "Not through the legal provision, through it, using it as pressure to push him into selling voluntarily." Vivian was very still. "The man who arrived last night," she said. "Hale." "Yes, I've seen men like him before," Vivian said. "In the business my father was in before he lost everything. They come in looking like solutions, and they leave looking like the reason you needed one." She paused. "How much trouble is Caleb actually in?" "Significant," Margaret said, "but not more than can be countered if he moves correctly." "And you're helping him move correctly." It was not quite a question. "I'm telling him what I see," Margaret said. "He decides what to do with it." Vivian studied her for a long moment with the eyes of someone recalibrating an assessment they had already made once and found insufficient. "You're in love with him," Vivian said. The words landed in the air of the dining room and stayed there. Margaret did not move. She did not confirm it, and she did not deny it, because both felt equally dishonest in different directions. Instead, she said, "What I feel about Caleb Whitaker is my own business. What matters right now is what's happening to this town and the people in it." "Those are not mutually exclusive things," Vivian said. "No," Margaret said. "They're not." Vivian looked at her coffee. "I came here because I needed a solution," she said quietly. "I told myself it was practical. I told myself I had assessed the situation clearly and made a rational decision." She paused. "But sitting here watching you, watching how you talk about him, watching how you worked out the problem with those papers last night when I could see the light on in the parlor until past midnight, I'm starting to think that I assessed everything correctly except the part that mattered most." "What part is that?" Margaret asked. "The part where the best person for him was already here," Vivian said. "Had been here for years, and nobody looked." The dining room was empty and quiet. "Miss Caldwell." "Vivian," she said. A beat. "Vivian," Margaret said. "I'm the hotel cook. I'm a large woman who peels potatoes and grows tomatoes and serves coffee to men who don't know my name. Whatever I feel privately is a luxury I don't get to spend." "That's the saddest thing I've heard since I got here," Vivian said. "And I've heard some genuinely sad things." Margaret stood up. "I'll get you more coffee," she said. "Margaret." Vivian's voice was not sharp, but it stopped her. "I want you to hear something. I'm not saying this to be kind, and I'm not saying it to clear my conscience. I'm saying it because I spent 2 years watching my father refuse to acknowledge things that were plainly in front of him, and I decided I would not be that person." She met Margaret's eyes. "You are the most capable woman I have encountered in 3 years of needing capable. This town has decided you are worth is not the same thing as what you are actually worth. And the fact that you have accepted the first number as if it were the second one is the only thing about you that I'd call a mistake." Margaret stood very still. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was even. Her hands were not. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at her work table for a full minute doing nothing. Then she went out to the garden and checked the tomatoes because they needed checking, and because she needed 60 seconds of being outside the hotel walls with her hands in something real. The tomatoes were doing well. They always did. She went back inside. Douglas Hale spent the morning writing letters at the desk in his room, which Margaret knew because she went in to change the linens, and he was not there, but his writing materials were, and there were 3 sealed envelopes on the desk ready for posting. 2 addressed to Denver and 1 addressed to a name and town she had not seen before, a law firm in Cheyenne. A law firm in Cheyenne. She memorized the name. She memorized it the way she memorized everything that mattered completely without writing it down, because written things could be found. At noon, Hale came down for lunch and spent 20 minutes talking to Mr. Hatch about the hotel's history and Willow Creek's development patterns and the general economic trajectory of the region. All of which were questions that would be perfectly natural from a man passing through, and all of which were, she was now entirely certain, intelligence gathering of the most careful kind. She served his lunch. She refilled his water. She remained precisely as invisible as he had decided she was. When he left the dining room, she cleared his table, and when she straightened up, she found herself face to face with Vivian, who had come through the side door and was standing there with an expression that said she had been listening and had heard enough. "He mentioned Caleb's name twice," Vivian said quietly. "To Mr. Hatch, asking about his character, his reputation for good judgment under pressure, whether the town respected him enough to follow his lead on major decisions. He's assessing whether Caleb has the local support to fight a legal battle," Margaret said. "If the town is behind him, a fight costs more. If the town has doubt, it's faster and cheaper to let the pressure do the work." "Then we need to make sure the town is behind him," Vivian said. "The town doesn't know what's happening." "Then someone should tell them," Vivian said. Carefully. In a way that doesn't panic anyone, but makes the situation clear. She looked at Margaret steadily. "You know these people. You've fed them and watched them for 10 years. Who would listen? Who would act?" Margaret thought. Not performed thinking, actual thinking, names and faces and histories running through her mind like water through familiar channels. "Gerald Marsh," she said. "He's lost more than most, and he's angry enough to be useful. Reverend Coles, he doesn't own property, but half the town trusts him absolutely. And the Morrison brothers, they have 2 farms bordering Caleb's land. They understand exactly what losing those water rights would mean, because they'd be the first ones to feel it." "Can you get to them without it reaching Hale?" "I can send Billy Marsh with messages that don't say what they're actually about," Margaret said. "He's 14. He's invisible in this town too." Vivian almost smiled. "You have a habit of finding the people others overlook." "Comes from being one," Margaret said. That afternoon, Margaret wrote 4 short notes. She gave them to Billy with a nickel per note and told him to deliver them quiet and quick, and not to mention who had sent him if anyone asked. Billy Marsh was 14 and sharp as a tack, and he understood in the way that children raised in complicated households understood things that the value of the nickel depended entirely on him keeping his mouth shut. By 5 o'clock, Gerald Marsh, Reverend Coles, and both Morrison brothers had sent back word that they would come to the hotel's back parlor at 7 that evening. At 6:45, Vivian Caldwell stood at the kitchen door and said, "Ready?" Margaret looked at her. "I'm the cook," she said. "I don't run meetings." "You organized this meeting," Vivian said. "You know the information. You know these people. I can help you present it because I understand the legal dimensions, but this is yours, Margaret." She paused. "Stop letting this town tell you what you are." Margaret dried her hands. She untied her apron. She walked into the back parlor. The 4 men were already there. Gerald Marsh with his arms crossed and his jaw set. Reverend Coles with his hands folded on his knees. The Morrison brothers side by side in the way that they did everything, reinforcing each other without words. They all looked at Margaret with varying degrees of surprise, because Margaret Ellison did not call meetings, and the fact of her standing at the front of a room had rearranged the air in a way that none of them had a prepared response to. "Gentlemen," she said, "there's a man staying in this hotel named Douglas Hale. He arrived 2 nights ago, and he is here on behalf of a land acquisition group in Denver. They know about the water rights provision. they have known for at least 2 years. And they sent Hale here at this specific moment because they calculated that Mr. Whitaker is running out of time and out of options, and might be persuaded to sell voluntarily before September. The room was completely silent. Then Gerald Marsh said, "How do you know all this?" "Because I serve his meals and change his linens, and he doesn't see me as someone worth being careful around," she said. "He's wrong about that." Robert Morrison said, "What does Caleb say?" "Caleb has gone to Cheyenne to access federal land records that may show the water rights provision was fraudulently inserted into the original agreement," she said. "He'll be back in 4 to 6 days. Until he returns, we need Hale to believe that nothing has changed. He cannot know that we know what he's doing." "And what is he doing?" Reverend Coles asked. "Right now, assessing whether this town has enough faith in Caleb to stand behind him in a legal fight," Margaret said. "So that's what we need to make absolutely certain he sees. People who trust Caleb. People who are not afraid. People who have no intention of letting outside money walk into this valley and take what feeds their families." Joseph Morrison leaned forward. "And if Caleb comes back from Cheyenne and the records don't show what he's hoping, then we deal with that when it comes," Margaret said. "But the first step is making sure Hale has no reason to accelerate his employer's plans before Caleb gets back." Gerald Marsh uncrossed his arms. He looked at her for a long moment, the look of a man recategorizing someone, moving them from one mental column to another. "You've been figuring this out yourself," he said. "Mr. Whitaker and I have been figuring it out together," she said. "He's doing the legal part. I'm doing the part that happens in this hotel." Marsh looked at Reverend Coles. Coles looked back. Something passed between them in the way that things passed between men who had known each other for 30 years. "All right," Marsh said. "What do you need us to do?" What happened next was the most efficient 40 minutes Margaret had spent in years. The men listened. They asked direct questions. They pushed back on 2 points, and she adjusted her thinking accordingly, because they knew things about Hale's movements in town that she had not yet seen, and the picture they assembled together was more complete than anything she could have built alone. Hale had also been to the land registrar's office in the county seat that morning. He had returned looking satisfied, which meant he had either confirmed something he already suspected or obtained something he had been waiting for. Which meant whatever the next step in his employer's plan was, it was closer to being triggered than Margaret had calculated. When the men left through the back door at 8:30, Vivian was waiting in the kitchen. "Well," she said. "Hale went to the county records office today," Margaret said. "We're out of more time than I thought. How much time do we have?" "I don't know," Margaret said. And the admission cost her something because she was a woman who prided herself on knowing, on seeing, on staying ahead of the thing coming toward her. "I don't know. But Caleb needs to come back with something solid, because whatever Hale found today, whatever his next step is, it's going to happen before we're ready." Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There's something else you should know. I wasn't entirely honest with you when we spoke this morning." Margaret looked at her. "The debt I told Caleb about," Vivian said. "It isn't just my father's. Part of it is mine. I made a bad investment 2 years ago. I believed someone who seemed trustworthy and turned out to be—" She stopped. Her jaw tightened. "The person I believed was a representative of a land acquisition group out of Denver." The kitchen went absolutely still. Margaret stared at her. "The same group," she said slowly. "I don't know for certain," Vivian said. "But the name on the documents was the same firm that's written on those envelopes in Hale's room." She met Margaret's eyes, and for the first time there was nothing composed or managed in her expression, just the bare, frightened face of a woman who had just understood the full shape of something she had walked into without knowing it. "I didn't come to Willow Creek by accident, Margaret. I saw an advertisement for Caleb's search in a Millhaven paper, but I think someone made sure I would see it." Margaret sat down. She sat down because her legs required it. Vivian Caldwell had not simply arrived as a coincidence among 31 women hoping for a better future. She had been sent, not knowingly, not willingly, but sent, positioned, placed in Caleb's path by people who wanted her here for reasons that had nothing to do with what she wanted and everything to do with what they needed. And those people were still in this hotel. sleeping in room 7, eating Margaret's cooking, waiting for Caleb to come home. Margaret did not sleep that night. She lay in her narrow room and stared at the ceiling and let everything she knew arrange itself into the shape it was actually making, rather than the shape she had initially believed it to be. Because the shape had changed. Vivian's revelation had changed it completely, the way a single additional piece of information sometimes did not simply add to a picture, but reorganized the entire picture around itself. This was not a land speculator who had opportunistically discovered a legal vulnerability. This was a coordinated operation that had been running for years, possibly since before Caleb's father died. Possibly since before the provision was ever inserted into the original agreement. Someone had been patient enough and organized enough to plant a legal trap 20 years ago. Wait for the right circumstances to spring it, and then position a woman, a real woman, with real problems and real debts as an asset, inside Caleb's own search process, without her ever knowing she was being used. That level of planning required resources. It required legal knowledge. It required someone with access to county records and the patience of a person who understood that the most valuable traps were the ones their targets walked into willingly. Thomas Harrow. The name kept coming back to her. At 4 a.m, she got up and put her clothes on and went to the kitchen, not because anything needed doing, but because the kitchen was where she thought most clearly, and she stood at the work table in the dark and worked through everything she knew until the first gray light started coming through the window and it was time to start breakfast. She made the biscuits. She started the coffee. She thought about Vivian Caldwell, lying in her room 2 floors up, carrying the weight of having been used without knowing it. And she thought about what that cost a person, not the financial cost, the other kind, the kind that made you question your own judgment and your own instincts, and every decision you had made in the last 2 years that had led you to this place. That was a particular kind of damage. Margaret knew it from the inside. At 6:30, Vivian came down. She had not slept either. It was visible in the set of her eyes and the particular stillness of her face that was not composure, but exhaustion wearing composure's clothes. She sat at the kitchen table, not the dining room, the kitchen, which meant she had stopped performing for an audience she no longer believed required performing for, and Margaret put coffee in front of her without asking. "Tell me the name of the man you invested with," Margaret said. "The one from Denver." Vivian wrapped her hands around the cup. His name was Garrett, Charles Garrett. He represented himself as a senior partner in a regional land development firm. "Did you ever meet anyone else from the firm?" "One other man, younger. He handled the documentation." She paused. "He said his name was Harrow." The word landed in the kitchen like a stone dropped from a height. Margaret set her coffee pot down very carefully. "Describe him," she said. Vivian did. The description matched everything Margaret knew about Thomas Harrow. Age coloring the particular quality of careful legal precision that his father had apparently passed to him, along with whatever else the Harrow family had been building in the years since they left Willow Creek. "He's here," Margaret said. "Not in town, but he's behind this. He drafted the provision in the original agreement, and he's been waiting for the right moment to use it, and now he's sent Hale to close the transaction before Caleb can find out what he's actually dealing with." Vivian stared at her. "How long have you known about Harrow?" "I've suspected since 2 nights ago," Margaret said. "I didn't know his connection to you until last night. That's the piece I was missing." She sat down across from Vivian. "You weren't placed here to marry Caleb." "I know that now," Vivian said tightly. "You were placed here to complicate things," Margaret said. "A woman with hidden debt appearing in Caleb's search at exactly the right moment, if he chose you. He'd be walking into a marriage with financial entanglement, tied to the very people trying to take his water rights. And if he didn't choose you, the fact of your presence and your withdrawal would add another layer of confusion and delay to an already pressured situation." She looked at Vivian steadily. "Either way, they gained something. You were a contingency, not a plan." Vivian was very still for a long moment. Then she said, "I want to help." "You're already helping." "No." Her voice was harder than Margaret had heard it. "I mean, I want to be useful in a way that actually costs them something. I have documentation of my investment with Garrett and Harrow. I have their signatures. I have the original prospectus they gave me, which I kept because I am a careful woman, and careful women keep documents." She met Margaret's eyes. "If Caleb finds the fraud in the original land agreement in Cheyenne, my documents could corroborate a pattern. The same people, the same methods operating across multiple states over multiple years." Margaret looked at her. "That's not a small thing to offer," she said. "No," Vivian said. "It isn't. It means involving yourself publicly in a legal dispute. It means your name in county records. It means Garrett and Harrow knowing you testified against them." "I know what it means," Vivian said. "They used me. I'd like to return the favor." For the first time, Margaret felt something toward Vivian Caldwell that was not suspicion or wariness, or the careful measurement of a woman assessing a potential threat. She felt something closer to genuine respect. "All right," Margaret said. "Keep the documents safe. Don't let Hale see you with them." "Hale doesn't look at me when you're in the room," Vivian said with dry precision. "He spends all his attention trying to figure out why you seem so comfortable with information you shouldn't have." "He's noticed," Margaret said. "He's noticed," Vivian confirmed. "I'd be careful today." Margaret thought about that for a moment. Then she thought about Douglas Hale, sitting in room 7, with his sealed letters addressed to Denver and to the Harrow firm in Cheyenne. And she thought about the fact that those letters had not yet been posted because she had checked the outgoing mail tray twice, and they had not appeared in it. He was waiting for something before he sent them. Waiting for a response. Waiting for a signal. She did not know from what or from whom, and that uncertainty was the most dangerous thing in the room. Hale came down for breakfast at 7:30 and was his usual easy, open-faced self, asking after the biscuits, complimenting the coffee-making small conversation with the 2 ranch hands who came in for a morning meal. Margaret served him and watched him and gave nothing away. And he watched her in return with a quality she had not seen from him before, something fractionally more attentive, something that had adjusted its estimation of her slightly upward without quite committing to the adjustment. I was not certain yet, but he was less certain of her invisibility than he had been 3 days ago. At 8:30, he said casually, refilling his own cup at the counter, "Miss Margaret, would you happen to know if there are many folks in town who might be persuaded to consider selling their property, small farms, that sort of thing? My employers are interested in development opportunities, and I thought the hotel cook might have a sense of who's struggling most right now." Margaret looked at him. She took exactly the amount of time that a woman who had just been asked an unexpected question would take before answering. "I wouldn't know much about that Mr. Hale," she said. "I know who orders what for breakfast. Past that, people's finances aren't my business." He smiled. "Of course not. Just thought I'd ask." "The Reverend might know," she said. "He tends to know most people's circumstances." "Good idea," Hale said. "I'll pay him a visit." He left the hotel at 9. The moment the front door closed behind him, Margaret untied her apron and went up the back stairs to the 2nd floor. She knocked on Gerald Marsh's wife's door. Ada, who she had not spoken to since the lunch where Ada had told her to remember her place, and stood in the hallway and waited. Ada opened the door. She looked at Margaret with the expression of a woman who had been expecting this conversation and had not decided yet whether she was going to have it. "The Reverend is in danger of being manipulated by the man in room 7, Margaret said. "If Hale gets to him before we do, he'll find a way to use whatever Reverend Coles tells him about who's struggling in this town to target the families least able to resist a buyout offer." Ada Marsh's eyes sharpened. Whatever she thought about Margaret's social position, Ada Marsh loved this town, the way a person loved the place where all their history lived, and Margaret had calculated correctly that this love was stronger than her ideas about propriety. "I'll go to Thomas myself," Ada said. "He won't talk to Hale after I've spoken to him." "Go now," Margaret said. "Hale's already headed that direction." Ada Marsh moved faster than Margaret would have predicted for a woman her age and her opinions. She was down the stairs and out the door with her hat on in 4 minutes flat, and Margaret went back to her kitchen with the particular satisfaction of having deployed exactly the right person for exactly the right task. The morning passed with the tight, controlled energy of a situation moving faster than ideal, but not yet out of hand. Billy Marsh came through at 10 with a message from Pete Aldridge, Caleb's ranch foreman, saying that 2 men had ridden through the Whitaker property the previous evening, asking the ranch hands questions about water flow and seasonal creek levels. The hands had answered without knowing they should not, and Aldridge wanted Margaret to know, because Caleb had told him before leaving that Margaret was to be kept informed of anything unusual. Caleb had told his foreman to keep her informed. She read that sentence twice. Then she wrote back to Aldridge telling him to keep the hands away from any further questioning and to document the names of the 2 riders if he could get them, and she sent Billy back with the note and a piece of pie for his trouble. At 11, Vivian appeared in the kitchen doorway with her coat on. "I need to go to the post office," she said. "Why?" "Because Hale has not posted his letters, and I want to know what he's waiting for." She held up a hand before Margaret could speak. "I'm not going to do anything visible. I'm going to ask Mrs. Penny at the counter whether any mail has arrived for the hotel in the last 3 days. She'll tell me because I'll ask nicely, and I'll buy stamps. If mail has arrived for Hale that he hasn't mentioned, then we know what he's waiting for," Vivian said. "Go," Margaret said. Vivian went. She was back in 22 minutes. "2 letters arrived for Hale yesterday afternoon," she said, pulling her gloves off. Mrs. Penny delivered them to the hotel herself because Mr. Hatch was at the counter and she handed them to him directly. "Mr. Hatch." Margaret said it slowly. "He would have given them to Hale's room." "Yes," Margaret said. "He would have." She paused. "Or he would have read them first." They looked at each other. Mr. Hatch was a tired, frightened man whose business was failing and who had 2 daughters in Omaha he had not seen in 3 years because he could not afford the travel. He was not a bad man. Margaret had worked for him for 10 years, and she knew the difference between a bad man and a frightened one. But frightened men made decisions that bad men could not have persuaded them to make in better circumstances, and Douglas Hale was very good at identifying frightened men. "How long has Hale been talking to Mr. Hatch?" Margaret said. Vivian shook her head slowly. "Every evening since he arrived. I thought it was just the natural conversation of a guest with the hotel proprietor. But if those letters came through Hatch first." "He's not just a guest," Margaret said. "He's been working Hatch from the beginning. The hotel is the information center of this town. Hatch hears everything. If Hale got access to Hatch's knowledge of this town's vulnerabilities, he knows exactly who to approach and exactly what offer to make." Vivian finished. Margaret stood at the work table and felt the walls of the situation close in by a fraction. They were not ahead of this anymore. They were even with it, maybe, or slightly behind. And Caleb was in Cheyenne at 12:30. Mr. Hatch called Margaret to his office at the back of the hotel, which he had done approximately twice in the entire 10 years she had worked for him. She went without expression and stood across the desk from him and waited while he arranged and rearranged the papers on his desktop in the way that people did when they were trying to start a conversation they had not figured out how to start. "Margaret," he said finally, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me straight." "Yes, sir." "Have you been getting into Mr. Hale's business?" She looked at him steadily. "I've been paying attention to what's happening in my hotel, Mr. Hatch." "It's my hotel," he said, but there was no heat in it, more apology than correction. "Yes, sir," she said. "Your hotel. My kitchen, my dining room, my linens, my garden, my 10 years. She paused. "What did Hale tell you?" Hatch's hands stopped moving on the papers. She had never spoken to him quite like that before. She had decided it was time. "He said he was worried that someone on the staff might interfere with a business transaction," Hatch said carefully. "A business transaction," she repeated. "Did he tell you what kind?" "Something to do with the water rights. He said it was complicated, but that in the end it would benefit the town." "Mr. Hatch," Margaret said, and she sat down in the chair across from him without being invited because this conversation required her to be at eye level with him, and this was too important for the performance of deference. "Douglas Hale works for people who want to buy the Whitaker water rights at a price that protects their investment, not this town's survival. If they acquire those rights, every farmer in this valley pays whatever they decide to charge. There's no competition, no alternative, No recourse. The town doesn't benefit. The town suffocates slowly and politely and calls it market conditions. Hatch stared at her. He said what he needed you to believe, she said. He's been saying exactly what he needed to every person in this town for 5 days. He's good at it. He does this for a living. She leaned forward slightly. Did he offer you anything? For the letters, for the information about who's struggling? The silence that followed told her everything before he spoke. He said he could make sure the hotel was purchased at a fair price when the town's economy declined further, Hatch said. He said it was inevitable. He said I should protect myself. And the letters? Another silence. Hatch was not a bad man. He was a man who had been frightened by someone very skilled at frightening people. I read them, he said quietly. I shouldn't have. I know I shouldn't have. But I read them, and then I told him what was in them. What was in them? One was from his employers confirming the terms of the offer to Caleb, he said. The other was, he stopped. Margaret. The other one was from a Thomas Harrow. It said that the county inspection has been moved up. It's not September anymore. Everything inside her went very still. When? She said. 3 weeks, Hatch said. The inspection is in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Caleb had ridden to Cheyenne thinking he had 8 weeks. He had 3. Margaret stood up. Mr. Hatch, she said. Do you have a fast horse? My brown mare, he said. She's the fastest animal I own. I need her. He stared at her. Margaret, you can't ride too. I can ride, she said. I grew up on a farm in eastern Kansas, and I have been riding since I was 6 years old. Nobody in this town ever asked. She held out her hand. The mare, Mr. Hatch, please. He reached into his desk drawer and put the key to the stable in her hand. She was at the stable in 4 minutes. She was on the road to Cheyenne in 10. She had left a note for Vivian in the kitchen, folded under the coffee pot, where Vivian would find it when she came to check. 3 sentences. Inspection moved to 3 weeks. Hatch compromised. Watch Hale. Do not let him send those letters. The ride was long, and she was not a young woman, and the mare was fast, but the road was not kind. She rode through the afternoon heat with her jaw set, and her hands steady on the reins, and her mind running through everything she needed to say to Caleb when she found him. Everything she needed him to understand, not just about the timeline, but about Harrow and Garrett and Vivian's documents, and the full shape of what they were actually dealing with. She stopped twice for water, the horses not hers, and kept moving. She reached the outskirts of Cheyenne at dusk of the second day, which meant she had pushed harder than she should have, and her back and legs were communicating their opinion of this clearly. She found the federal land office on the main street closed for the evening naturally, and she found the boarding house 2 streets over, where Caleb had told Pete Aldridge he would be staying, and she tied the mare and walked to the door and knocked. The woman who answered said Caleb Whitaker was in the back parlor. Margaret walked through the house and opened the parlor door. Caleb was at a table covered in documents with 2 other men, a federal clerk by the look of his coat, and a younger man with the ink-stained hands of someone who had been copying records all day. All 3 of them looked up when she walked in. Caleb's face went through 4 expressions in the time it took her to cross the room to him. Surprise. Relief. Something she did not have a name for, yet that was there and gone before she could examine it. And then the sharpened focus of a man who understood that if Margaret Ellison had ridden 2 days to find him, whatever she was carrying could not wait. How long do we have, he said. Not why are you here, not what happened, not how did you get here. He looked at her face, and he read it, and he asked the only question that mattered. 3 weeks, she said. The inspection has been moved. Hale got word and Hatch saw the letter. Hatch told Hale everything who's struggling in town, who might sell what people know. She pulled the chair out across from him and sat down because her legs required it. But Caleb, we have something they don't know we have. She told him about Vivian's documents. She told him about Garrett and Harrow and the pattern of operations across multiple states. She told him what she had worked out about the provision, that it was added, deliberately written, precisely inserted into a sloppy document, by someone who knew exactly what they were constructing and how long they were willing to wait for it to become useful. The two men with Caleb had gone completely still. The federal clerk said, "If there's documentary evidence of fraud across multiple jurisdictions, Vivian Caldwell has the original prospectus with both Garrett's and Harrow's signatures," Margaret said. "She kept it because she's a careful woman." "And she'll testify?" the clerk asked. "She came to me last night and told me everything voluntarily," Margaret said. "She wants to." Caleb was looking at her with an expression she could not read in the way she could usually read him something that was past the point where it had a simple name. "You rode 2 days," he said. "The inspection is in 3 weeks," she said. "There wasn't a slower option." "You could have sent word with Billy Marsh." "I could have," she said. "But you needed to hear this directly, and you needed to hear all of it. Not 3 sentences on a piece of paper. And I needed to know you understood the full picture before you walked back into Willow Creek with Hale sitting in my hotel waiting for you." He looked at her for a long moment. "Margaret," he said. "Don't," she said. "Don't what?" "Don't say whatever you're about to say with 2 strangers in the room, and no sleep on either side, and a 3-week deadline pressing on us from every direction." She held his gaze. "There's time for that later. Right now we need to talk about what you found in those records." He looked at her for one more second. Then he turned to the federal clerk. "Show her," he said. The clerk slid a document across the table. Margaret looked at it. It was a copy of the original land agreement filed with the federal office in 1851, the parallel record Caleb had come to find. And the 3rd page where the water rights provision appeared in the county copy was different. It was not different in the way she had suspected. It was not a matter of different language or different phrasing. It was simply absent. The provision did not exist in the federal record. It had been added to the county copy afterward. The entire legal mechanism that Douglas Hale's employers had been using to pressure Caleb that the county inspector was planning to enforce that had put 300 people's water supply at risk. It was a forgery. A 20-year-old forgery carefully maintained waiting for exactly this moment. Thomas Harrow forged a federal land provision into a county document, Caleb said quietly. His father was the county clerk. He had access. He had the knowledge. He had the patience. He paused. "And he has been waiting 20 years for my father to die and for me to be alone and under enough pressure to either sell voluntarily or lose a legal battle I didn't know I was in." "He didn't account for one thing," Margaret said. "What's that?" "He didn't account for someone paying attention," she said. The clerk was already writing. Caleb looked at Margaret across the table covered in documents and 20 years of patient fraud and the evidence that was going to dismantle it, and he said very quietly, so only she could hear, "I am going to need you to stay close when we get back." She met his eyes. "I've been in that hotel for 10 years, she said. "I'm not going anywhere." They rode back to Willow Creek together. Not side by side, the entire way. The road did not always allow it, but close enough that when Margaret's mare stumbled on a loose stretch of rock in the 2nd hour. Caleb's hand was at the bridle before she had fully registered what happened. He steadied the horse without comment, and they kept moving, and she did not thank him because it had happened too fast for thank you, and because something between them had moved past the territory where small gestures required formal acknowledgement. The federal clerk had given them certified copies of everything. The original 1851 filing. The comparison documentation showing the discrepancy between the federal record and the county copy. A sworn affidavit from the senior archivist confirming that the federal document had never been amended and that the provision appearing in the county version had no corresponding federal filing date. It was not everything they needed, but it was enough to stop the inspection. Enough to open an investigation. Enough to make Douglas Hale's employers very uncomfortable about the next step in a plan that had just discovered its foundation was visible. Caleb had also sent a wire from Cheyenne to a lawyer in Denver, not the Harrow firm's Denver, a different Denver, a man named Carlisle, who had worked federal land cases for 20 years, and who the federal clerk had recommended with the specific endorsement of a man who had seen Carlisle win cases that should not have been winnable. Carlisle would arrive in Willow Creek within the week. "Tell me about Hatch," Caleb said on the second afternoon of writing. He's frightened, Margaret said. He made a decision out of fear, and then he told me about it, which means he knows it was wrong, and he's looking for a way to correct it that doesn't cost him everything. Can he be trusted now? He gave me his best horse, she said. That's not nothing. Caleb thought about that. What does he need? Someone to tell him that he still has a place in this town after everything is settled, she said. He's afraid that what he did to survive is going to be what he's remembered for. Is that a reasonable fear? Depends on who's doing the remembering, she said. He looked at her sideways. And Vivian. Margaret considered this honestly. She came here for the wrong reasons and stayed for better ones. She has documents that could break this case open beyond Willow Creek, beyond one forged provision, a pattern of fraud across multiple victims in multiple states. She knows it, and she's willing to use it. She paused. She deserves a clean start somewhere. Whatever debt she had, she's paying it back in a currency that costs more than money. Caleb was quiet for a moment. She would have been a practical wife, he said. Yes, Margaret said. She would have. But practical wasn't what I needed. No, Margaret said. It wasn't. He did not say anything else on that subject. She did not push. They rode the rest of the day with the particular comfortable silence of two people who had too much to say and enough sense to wait for the right moment to say it. They reached Willow Creek at mid-morning of the third day. Billy Marsh saw them coming from 2 blocks away and ran. By the time Caleb and Margaret dismounted in front of the hotel, Gerald Marsh was on the porch, and Reverend Coles was crossing the street, and both Morrison brothers were coming from the direction of the livery, and all of them had the look of people who had been waiting with great effort and limited patience. Pete Aldridge had ridden in from the ranch the previous evening, Margaret learned in the first 60 seconds of being back. The 2 men who had ridden through the Whitaker property asking questions about water flow had returned a second time, and Aldridge had sent them off the property with language that Margaret gathered was not suitable for the Reverend's ears, but the point was made they had come back, which meant Hale's employers were accelerating. Where is Hale now? Caleb asked. Hotel, Gerald Marsh said. Hasn't left since yesterday morning. He knows something shifted. Doesn't know what. Good, Caleb said. Keep it that way for the next 2 hours. He looked at Margaret. She nodded once and went inside. Vivian was in the kitchen. She had the documents spread on the work table. The Garrett and Harrow prospectus, the investment agreement with both signatures. 3 letters she had received during the investment period that she had kept out of the same careful instinct that made her keep everything. And she looked up when Margaret walked in with the expression of a woman who had been holding a position alone for 3 days and was very glad to see reinforcement arrive. You're back, Vivian said. We're back, Margaret said. And we have the federal comparison documents. She looked at the papers on the table. Are those? Everything I have, Vivian said. I wrote it all out last night. Every meeting, every date, every name, every promise they made, and exactly how they made it. She straightened the papers with precise hands. I want this to be usable. I want it in a form that a lawyer can work with immediately. Carlisle arrives within the week, Margaret said. Caleb's lawyer from Denver. Something shifted in Vivian's face relief. Margaret thought, though, Vivian would probably have called it by a different name. Then we have time to prepare properly, Vivian said. We have less time than we want, Margaret said. The inspection was moved to 3 weeks. Hale knows that we know something. He hasn't sent his letters yet, which means he's still deciding whether to accelerate or withdraw, and we need him to decide before we're ready for him to. Vivian looked at her. You want him to make a move. I want him to make the wrong move, Margaret said. A man who accelerates when he's uncertain makes mistakes that a man who waits doesn't make. She picked up the coffee pot that had been sitting cold on the stove and moved to light the burner. I need to think about how to push him. I can push him, Vivian said quietly. Margaret turned around. He doesn't know what I know about Garrett and Harrow, Vivian said. As far as Hale is aware, I'm still a woman who came here looking for a wealthy husband and found a complicated situation. If I approach him, not obviously casually, the way a nervous woman might approach someone who seems knowledgeable about business, and I let him think I'm looking for my own exit from a situation that's becoming uncertain. He'll try to use you again, Margaret said. Yes, Vivian said. And this time, I'll know exactly what he's doing, and I'll let him do just enough of it to commit himself on record. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. That's a risk, she said. Everything in the last 3 weeks has been a risk, Vivian said. At least this one is mine to choose. There was no arguing with that. Be careful, Margaret said. I'm always careful, Vivian said. I just wasn't always careful about the right things. Caleb came through the kitchen door at noon. He had been with Gerald Marsh and the Morrison brothers for 2 hours, and whatever had been said in that meeting had done something to the quality of energy in the town. Margaret could feel it, the way you felt, a change in weather, a collective straightening, a shift from frightened waiting to purposeful waiting, which was a different animal entirely. He stopped when he saw Vivian's documents on the table. He picked up the top page. He read it without speaking for a full 2 minutes. This is Harrow's signature, he said. Yes, Vivian said. I know this signature. He set the page down carefully. My father had letters from the elder Harrow, the clerk. This is the same hand, different generation. He looked at Vivian directly. You came here not knowing any of this. I came here because I needed a solution, and I saw an advertisement, and I told myself it was a rational decision, she said. I've since revised my understanding of what I was actually doing. They used you, he said. They tried, she said. I'd like to help make sure they don't get the chance again, with anyone. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Thank you, he said. And it came out the way genuine gratitude came out when a person was not performing it, simply without decoration, as though the word itself was sufficient. Don't thank me yet, Vivian said. Let's see if it actually works first. He almost smiled. Then he looked at Margaret, who had been standing at the stove with the coffee going, and her back slightly to both of them, giving them the room that the conversation required. Margaret, he said. She turned. Come with me, he said. There's something I need to handle, and I want you there when I do it. She followed him out through the hotel lobby and up the stairs to the second floor, and he stopped in front of room 7 and knocked. Douglas Hale answered the door in his shirt sleeves, with the slightly cautious expression of a man who had been waiting for something and was not yet certain whether this was it. Mr. Whitaker, he said, I heard you were back. Word travels fast in a small town, Caleb said. I'd like to talk. May we come in? Hale's eyes moved to Margaret. Something shifted in them. Of course, he said. They sat Caleb across from Hale Margaret, to the side where Hale would have to consciously redirect his attention to look at her, which meant he would try not to, and Caleb set the certified copy of the federal comparison document on the table between them. Hale looked at it. He did not touch it. He was a skilled man, and he did not let his face do much, but his hands, which had been easy and relaxed on the arms of his chair, were slightly different now. Not tense. Stillness that was working harder than it had been before. The Federal Land Office in Cheyenne maintains parallel records for all original property filings in the territory, Caleb said. I expect you know that. I'm aware of how federal filing systems work, yes, Hale said. Then you'll understand what you're looking at. Caleb tapped the document once. The provision that was presented to me by the county office does not exist in the federal record. It was inserted into the county copy after the original filing. The federal archivist has provided a sworn affidavit to that effect. The room was very quiet. Hale said nothing for a full 10 seconds. Then, that's a significant allegation. It's a documented fact, Caleb said. Not an allegation. Another silence. Mr. Whitaker, Hale said, and his voice had shifted, still controlled, still professional, but working now the way a man's voice worked when he was recalculating in real time. I want you to understand that I am simply a representative. I was engaged to present an offer in good faith. Whatever background circumstances you may have uncovered, the firm that engaged you has a prior history, Caleb said, documented, across multiple states, multiple victims, a pattern of fraudulent property pressure going back at least 6 years. We have corroborating testimony from one of those prior victims and documentary evidence including signatures." He paused. "I'd suggest that before you send those letters to Denver, you have a conversation with whoever hired you about the exact nature of what you've been representing." Hale's eyes moved to Margaret. Not a glance. A real look, the first real look he had given her in 5 days. She held it without moving. "You've been busy, Miss Margaret," he said. "I serve coffee," she said, "and I pay attention." He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked back at Caleb. "I'd like to speak with my employers before this goes further," he said. "That's your right," Caleb said. He stood. "You should know that a federal lawyer named Carlisle arrives in Willow Creek within the week. Whatever communication you have with your employers between now and then, I'd encourage transparency. The federal investigation that's going to follow this will be considerably more interested in who knew what and when than in the specific transaction." He picked up the document. "Good day, Mr. Hale." They left the room. In the hallway, Margaret let out a breath she had been holding for approximately 4 minutes. "He's going to send those letters today," she said quietly. "I know," Caleb said. "That's what I want him to do." She looked at him. "Carlisle needs them to move," he said. "If Hale's employers go to ground before the investigation opens, we have documents but no active case. If they respond to Hale's communication by accelerating their plan, by sending more people, by applying pressure through official channels, by attempting to use Greer at the county office to push the inspection forward." He paused. "Then we have them moving. Moving people make evidence. Carlisle needs evidence, not just history." She thought about this. "You're not trying to stop them," she said. "You're trying to get them to commit." "I'm trying to get them to step into the open," he said. "They've been operating in paperwork and proxy for 20 years. I want them standing somewhere visible when this breaks." She looked at him with the attention she had always given him, and something else now, something that had no name, but that was made of 4 years of morning coffee and 31 interviews, and 2 days of writing, and the particular quality of a man who, when given the full picture, became more than she had already believed him to be. "That's a good plan," she said. "I had good information," he said. I was looking at her with the expression she had not been able to name in the parlor in Cheyenne, the one that had arrived and retreated before she could fully see it. But it was here now, and it was staying, and she could see it clearly, and what it was simple and enormous, and she was not ready for it, and also she had been ready for it for longer than she could honestly account for. "Caleb," she said. "I know," he said. "Not here, not yet." "The timing is terrible," he said. "I know that too." He did not look away from her. "But I want you to know that when this is finished, when Carlisle has his case, and Hale is gone, and the inspection is settled, there is something I intend to say to you, and I want you to be thinking about your answer while everything else is happening." She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. He nodded once. They went back downstairs. The next 8 days were the most concentrated exercise in controlled chaos that Margaret had ever managed, and she had once single-handedly organized the feeding of 97 people during a blizzard, when the supply wagons were 3 weeks late, and the town had nothing but what she could stretch. Hale sent his letters the afternoon of the confrontation in his room. Margaret knew because she was watching from the kitchen window when Billy Marsh, not there. Billy, a different boy. Hale had paid, carried the envelopes to the post office. She noted the time. She sent a wire to Carlisle's office through Pete Aldridge, who rode to the telegraph in the next town over, because the Willow Creek Telegraph had been one of the first things to close when the railroad rerouted. Vivienne executed her approach to Hale that same evening. She sat near him at the bar after supper and ordered a small whiskey and allowed herself to look uncertain in the specific way she had described. Not performed uncertainty. She was too skilled for that, but the real uncertainty of a woman who was genuinely weighing difficult options and allowing someone to see it because she needed them to think she needed their guidance. Hale talked to her for 40 minutes. He told her considerably more than he intended to, including the name of the attorney at the Cheyenne firm who was managing the legal angle of the operation, a name that was not Thomas Harrow, which meant Harrow was above the Cheyenne office, which meant the network was larger than even Margaret had calculated. Vivienne came to the kitchen at 10 that night and told Margaret everything word for word with the precision of a woman who had kept careful records for the last 3 years and knew the value of exact language. Margaret wrote it all down. 3 days later, Carlyle arrived. How was a small, compact man in his 50s with unremarkable clothes and remarkable eyes, the eyes of someone who had been listening to careful liars for 20 years and had developed a specific form of attention that did not look like attention until it was too late for the person being attended to. He spent his first evening with Caleb and Margaret and Vivienne going through everything they had. At the end of the evening, he said, "This is enough to open a federal fraud investigation. The pattern of activity across multiple jurisdictions elevates it above county jurisdiction entirely." He looked at the documents spread across the parlor table. Harrow's firm is going to have a very uncomfortable next several months. "The inspection," Caleb said. "The one they moved up." "Unenforceable," Carlyle said. "The provision it's based on is fraudulent. I'll have an injunction filed by the end of the week that pauses any county action on the water rights until the federal investigation concludes." He looked up. "Which means you have time, Mr. Whitaker." "Time," Caleb said slowly. "The original legal urgency that was driving your—" Carlyle glanced at his notes. "Marriage search is no longer operative. You can address that question on your own terms and your own timeline." The parlor was quiet. Margaret was very still. Caleb looked at her. She looked back. "Thank you, Mr. Carlyle," Caleb said. "We'll talk more in the morning." Carlyle left. Vivienne stood up from her chair, gathered her papers with great deliberateness, and said without looking at either of them, "I believe I'll turn in early," and left the room with the particular tact of a woman who had learned precisely when her presence was not the point. The parlor door closed. Margaret and Caleb were alone. The fire had burned down to coals. The documents were still across the table. Outside, Willow Creek was quiet, in the way that it had not been quiet for weeks. Not the hollow quiet of a dying town. Something different. Something that had the quality of a held breath releasing. "The legal urgency is gone," Margaret said. "Yes," he said. "You don't need to marry anyone before September." "No," he said. "I don't need to." She folded her hands in her lap. "That changes things," she said. "Does it?" he said. She looked at him directly. "It means whatever you say to me now, you say it without a deadline behind it, without a problem that needs solving, without any practical reason in the world that makes it convenient." She paused. "That's what I told you in the beginning. I told you I didn't want to be chosen because I could fix a problem." "I remember," he said. "I remember every word you've said to me, Margaret. I've been turning them over for 3 weeks." And he stood up from his chair and crossed the room and sat in the chair beside her, not across the table beside her, which was different, which closed the specific distance that had existed between them since the morning coffee 4 years ago, when she was furniture and he was the man she served. "You told me the most important question was, who would stay if I had nothing," he said. "You asked it about whoever I might marry, but I've been thinking about it differently." He looked at her steadily. "You rode 2 days alone to find me in Cheyenne when I had nothing useful to offer you. No security, no certainty, no resolution. Just a complicated mess, and a 3-week deadline, and the need for someone to carry bad news 100 miles. He paused. "That's the answer, Margaret. That's what I was looking for in 31 interviews and never found because the person who had it was never in the room." She was quiet. "I was in the room," she said. "Every time." "I know," he said. "That's what I'm apologizing for, again, and more completely this time." She looked at him for a long moment. "Caleb," she said, "I am a hotel cook. I have $12, saved a good garden, and 2 dresses that aren't work clothes. I am not young, and I am not small, and I have spent 10 years being told by this town what I am worth, and accepting a lower number than the truth." "I know what you are worth," he said. "Do you? You want me to say it plainly," he said. "I've spent my whole life talking plainly," she said. "I'd like to hear it back once." He took her hand. He held it in both of his, her rough, warm, work-capable hands that had built more than this town had ever credited her for, and he looked at her with the full weight of a man who had stopped performing composure for an audience and was simply being honest in a room with one person. "You are the most remarkable person I have encountered in 38 years of living," he said. "You saw what nobody else could see, said what nobody else would say, and rode 100 miles to make sure I had what I needed when the stakes were highest. You did all of that without being asked, without being paid, and without any reason in the world to do it, except that it was the right thing, and you knew it was the right thing." He paused. "I don't want to marry you because you fix my problems, Margaret. I want to marry you because every problem I've faced in the last 3 weeks, I've faced better with you in the room. And I don't want a life where you're not in the room." She looked at him. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were not. "That was plainly said," she managed. "I had time to practice," he said. 100 miles of road gives a man opportunity to work out what he means to say." She almost laughed. The almost laugh became something else, something warmer and more complicated, and she looked at the man sitting beside her, the man she had served coffee to for 4 years without being seen. The man who had finally looked, the man who had listened when she spoke and acted on what she said and ridden back beside her across hard country without needing to make it into anything other than what it was. And she thought about beans climbing their poles in the dark and tomatoes growing, because that was their nature, and the value of a person being entirely independent of whether anyone had gotten around to noticing it yet. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said. "That was your question, wasn't it?" "I hadn't quite gotten to the question yet." "I know," she said. "But I know what the question was going to be, and yes." He looked at her for a long moment with that expression she had finally learned to read completely, the one that was not composure or courtesy or the performance of either, but something underneath all of that, something quiet and certain and entirely his. Then he said, "Well then," and she said, "Well then." Carlisle filed the injunction 4 days later. The county inspection was suspended pending the federal fraud investigation into the discrepancy between the original land filing and the county copy. Silas Greer. The county clerk was quietly informed that his cooperation with the investigation would be noted in his favor, and Greer, who turned out to have been pressured by Harrow's firm rather than a willing participant, produced 3 years' worth of correspondence that expanded the federal case considerably beyond Willow Creek. Douglas Hale left the hotel on a Tuesday morning. He paid his bill, tipped his hat to Margaret at the counter, and said, "You're a difficult woman to underestimate, Miss Margaret." She said, "Most people manage it just fine." And he almost smiled and walked out the door, and she never saw him again. Vivian Caldwell stayed another 2 weeks to work with Carlisle and give her testimony. On the morning she left, she came to the kitchen and stood across the work table from Margaret and said, "I came here looking for a solution, and I found out I was someone else's." She paused. "Thank you for making sure I didn't end up being useful to the wrong people." "Thank you for choosing not to be," Margaret said. They did not hug. They were not that kind of women. But they looked at each other for a moment with the recognition of two people who had been useful to each other in ways that went beyond what either of them had planned, and that was enough. The wedding was in October. Reverend Coles performed it in the hotel dining room because Margaret said a church felt like someone else's life, and the hotel felt like hers. And Caleb said wherever she wanted was the right place, and that was the end of the discussion. Gerald Marsh came. Ada Marsh came and shook Margaret's hand with a firmness that was the closest she was capable of coming to an apology. And Margaret accepted it as one because she was a practical woman, and practical women did not require perfect gestures when honest ones were available. Billy Marsh cried. He denied it for years afterward. Mr. Hatch sat in the back of the room and looked at the woman who had run his hotel for 10 years and kept it alive through drought and railroad rerouting and a fraud scheme that would have taken the whole valley down. And he looked at the man standing beside her, who had finally had the sense to see what had been in front of him all along, and he blew his nose into his handkerchief loudly enough that Reverend Coles paused and waited for him to finish. Margaret's garden expanded the following spring, not just behind the hotel, out to the Whitaker ranch, where she had plans for the south-facing slope that she had been thinking about since the first time Caleb described the land to her over the parlor table with the fraud documents spread between them. She put in 3 new varieties of tomatoes and a herb section and a row of sunflowers that had no practical purpose whatsoever, except that she had always wanted sunflowers, and nobody had ever given her a reason not to have them. The federal case against Harrow and Garrett took 14 months to fully resolve. Thomas Harrow was disbarred. The fraudulent provision was formally expunged from the county records. The water rights remained with the Whitaker property. Willow Creek did not become what it had been before the railroad rerouted. Some things once changed do not change back, and Margaret had always understood that. But it became something else, something that had a different kind of stability than the old kind, rooted not in the assumption that prosperity would keep arriving from outside, but in the understanding of what the people who stayed were actually capable of building with what they had. The hotel survived. The Morrison farm survived. A new schoolhouse went up the following year, and the teacher they hired said she had chosen Willow Creek specifically because she had heard it was the kind of town that stood behind its people. She had heard right. And in the kitchen of the Whitaker Ranch on a Tuesday morning, in the spring of 1876, Margaret Ellison Whitaker stood at her work table with the window open and the smell of the garden coming through and a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow because she had been too absorbed in her planting plans to remember to drink it. And Caleb came in from the yard and picked up her coffee and drank it himself, because in 6 months of marriage he had learned that this was simply what happened to coffee left unattended within his reach, and she said without looking up, "That was mine." And he said, "You weren't drinking it." And she said, "That is not the point." And he set the empty cup down and came to stand behind her, and looked at her planting plans over her shoulder, and said, "The sunflowers again. Always the sunflowers," she said. He put his hand on her shoulder. She put hers over his. Outside the window. Willow Creek moved through its morning imperfect recovering genuinely alive, and 2 people who had spent years in the same room without seeing each other stood together in the one place where everything had finally completely and irrevocably come right. The woman who had once been invisible was seen. She had always been worth seeing, and the man who finally looked never looked away again.